Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makbool with you at PTV World, and of course with Farooq Baddafi and Raja Faisal as well in the studios. We're going to be talking about in our show today about two important topics. The first is in reference to what is going on within the political domains of India and China, the kind of relationship that has evolved, particularly since the clashes that we've seen along the Himalayan border back in 2020. And this is important because since then a number of talks between the top military leaderships of both the countries have gone underway, but unfortunately there hasn't been any progress made. There have been certain instances where the leaders of both the countries have met briefly, but they haven't had a face-to-face conversation since this Thursday. And this is important because this particular meeting was held on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, and in-depth and candid discussion was held according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And so a number of issues, particularly those surrounding the border region tensions, were part of the discussion between India and China. And so it's important then to see exactly how this will unfold in the future, given the fact that this is the first time the two leaders have met since 2020. So when we talk about the kind of start of conversation around these topics that has indeed begun on the sidelines, how exactly will then it pan out, and how will it impact the kind of military installations we've seen along the border, and how, of course, both countries view these tensions. It is also important to note that there were a number of consequences with regards to this particular tension as well, including economic trade relations with China, and then, of course, the kind of actions that were taken by India along the border with increased installations to get more civilian buildup. This is important also in respect to the kind of relationship that is further being pursued by India with its Western countries and also the Quad Alliance, and whether or not a similar sentiment is also extended towards India in terms of containing China, and how will that actually amount to something that will benefit India, something that still remains to be seen. At the same time, if the two leaders are in fact talking and meeting and they've had a candid and in-depth discussion around the issues, does that mean that we'll be seeing more of that in the future? We're going to be exploring that in our first segment of the show today. Our next one is going to take a look at the upcoming G20 summit in India, before which we have seen that Amnesty International and including other human rights organizations have written an open letter to the leaders of the countries, the organizations that have been invited to this G20 summit, calling upon them to raise this issue with India and highlighting the different areas that have seen a lot of repression and human rights violations in the illegally occupied territory, especially since the aftermath of the unilateral actions of August 2019. And this is important, especially in terms of how this particular summit, of course, is going to impact the kind of voices that are going to be raised there, and what sort of consequence will exist if leaders of the countries participating and going to India can actually stress upon these issues. At the same time, the letter, of course, also calls for the release and in-depth investigations into the arrests of a number of freedom rights activists and journalists within the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, calling upon their immediate release, and the fact that this is something that needs to be highlighted further by the international community. What exactly, of course, is going to happen and the kind of value and substance that these letters hold is something that we're going to explore at the end of the show today. As always, of course, Farooq and Faisal will be joining in the discussion. We've also been joined online by Dr. Jameel Ahmed Khan, who's a former ambassador, and by Samit Peer, who's the political analyst from New Delhi. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. Let me start with you, Ambassador Jameel. The discussion around border tensions between India and China, of course, have been going on, especially since the clash that we saw in 2020. But now the two leaders have also met, and in what has been briefed by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, they've had a candid and in-depth discussion around issues along the border. Of course, this is only just the beginning or the first meetup, so it's not that we're expecting anything tangible coming out of it. But do you think that this is something that points towards a different direction than before as to how this negotiation will now take place?
Well, at least this shake hand meeting that breaks the ice, and this shake hand meeting at a multilateral forum, it definitely has some advantage. But as you said, that we can't really expect any tangible results. Um, Even otherwise, on the sideline meetings, we do not have the structured agenda-wise points Mostly it doesn't happen, and mostly the joint statement is also not issued. In this case, also the joint statement was not issued, and somehow the two countries have started claiming that who invited whom and who was which was the country which invited the other country. So even that very good gesture of shake and meeting, a sideline meeting, that also became a little sore because of these claims and counterclaims. That is one. But the good part is that they both agree. Both leaders agreed, as the Foreign Office reports from India and China, that they've discussed about the de-escalation mechanism and directing their concerned organizations and agencies to find the ways and means to de-escalate the tension on the border line of actual control, Ladakh and those disputed areas. So that is one aspect, but it's not going to be so simple because 65 patrolling points out of 65, 26 are still manned and occupied by the Chinese troops. And Indian troops have obviously withdrawn from there. So that is one sore point, and that there obviously can it would take quite a while to discuss or to at least bring that point in the agenda because Chinese have constructed their infrastructure on that side. So this dispute is not that fresh, 2020, because there was a problem in 1962 also, where 80,000 of Chinese troops had participated in about 12,000 Indian troops had participated, and Indian side had really lost about 1,200 soldiers, and whereas the Chinese had a very minimal. So we are talking about two giants, and China obviously takes precedence over its military strength, equipment, and strength. For example, India has 1.46 million troops, whereas China has 20 million troops. So see the difference. And India has $72 billion budget, and I'm going to now correlate it with the actual the political and the military dispute, what is going on. So India has $72 billion budget, about 2 years old figures I could get, and Chinese has about $224 billion. So there's a huge difference so far as the military might is concerned. But somehow these two big countries, it's detrimental more for the India because India is making economic progress, which is obviously quite enviable. And India, our Foreign Office, has already congratulated the scientists who have gone to the moon and in a bare minimum cost and efforts. So if India and China also, but more importantly, India wants to maintain the trajectory of their progress for their own and in their own interest, then they'll have to de-escalate it not only with China, but also with Pakistan. And unless they de-escalate their tensions, the problem there and the people, intellectuals, and the scholars of India, they started realizing and they started also mentioning that India, after having had about more than 5 defense agreements with the United States, and last 3 agreements are towards the containment of China, at least aimed at towards the, it doesn't mention it, but all the those ingredients of the agreements and the strength which India is trying to gain in terms of its technology, it is directed towards the containment of China. And it's not only on the land side, but also it is on the Indian Ocean and in the Indian Ocean, India Pacific Ocean, where India is part of the string of alliance, and Pakistan is part of a string of pearls, which is spearheaded by China, and a string of alliance, which is so all these things. What does it imply to? There is an international politics as well as there is a regional politics. So one has to really interpret it both in the context of international politics and to what extent India would compromise its a very high trajectory of progress by not having or by not patching up its disputes with its neighboring country, and
Right,
that too
absolutely,
China.
and that's an important point that you've raised, and I'll explore that further with Samit Pirsab as well. But let me first begin by congratulating on the successful mission of ISRO, especially the kind of contribution that existed by female scientists that was very welcome to see. But Pirsab, when we take a look at the situation between, of course, India and China, this is something that we have seen over the years also grow and especially escalate in 2020. And while this is something that may be a first step towards the right direction, but can you also elaborate on what the ambassador was talking about, whether this is actually a priority for the Indian political setup, for the state to actually explore the regional collaborations, trade and economic ties much more than the kind of partnerships that we've been seeing emerging from the Western Front, many of which are pointed towards containing China?
Thank you, Sanaji, very much for having me on your show, and many thanks for your congratulations. I appreciate it. Well, ma'am, India is a country which believes in peace, but peace at what cost? Supreme national interest is what prevails. We are ready to have peace with anybody and everybody in the world. We believe in Vasudevam Kutumbakam. But at the same time, there are some fundamentals which are not compromisable. We cannot compromise on that, like national integrity, sovereignty of the land. So vis-a-vis China, our strategy has been very clear. You have to respect our sensitivities, our borders, and our, ethos. So pre-20 position is where you have to go back. We have been very clear even in the military level. Look, Depsang and Demchuk are the two, traction points where you have to de-escalate first. Out of the five friction points, three have been already settled. These two remain to be settled. And if the things go back to what they were around 3 years back, the things can go better. But having Chinese and us looking at with each other with a mirror deployment on either side, you can't have trade and business going on simultaneously. With Pakistan, it's again the terror and talks. It's the same paradigm. Nothing has changed. So if you see the position of India, it is consistent. It is uniform. We have not changed anything. We are up for peace and tranquility with anybody to everybody in the world. We have great relations with the Muslim world. Now, today, Honorable Prime Minister was in Greece. He's got the highest civilian award. We've done a lot of pacts, mobility pacts, and economic types with the Greeks. So we are doing it wherever we are going. UAE is our third highest trading partner. And, within a few years, we plan to have $100 billion trade with UAE. So with all those things happening, Iran, Iraq, we're doing business with everybody. So there's no religious-based foreign policy. There is no region-based foreign policy. It's only the national interest, which has to be respected. And when it comes to safety security of 1.4 billion people, what we are, that cannot be compromised in any way whatsoever. We are here to economically grow and cooperate with anybody. But vis-a-vis China and Pakistan, there are some issues which need to be ironed out. And I hope in due course of time, if they are ironed out, the things can go better. That is what we believe in. And as far as the military might is concerned, we are able to handle China or Pakistan, both simultaneously. We are a time-tested nuclear tried now. So it is not easy for anybody to walk through a nuclear tried. It does not happen. This is practically impossible. And even Xi Jinping realizes. That's why, Wang Yi wanted to have relations with India. And though there was no formal meeting, just a handshake happened. And again, the thing, what Dr. Jaishankar has been reiterating has been told to them, look, you have to get things good and better at LAC, then we can talk of trade, cooperation. Look at China, the exports are down by 14%. There's a deflation of 0.3%. The factory output is out by 5.1%. And the overall exports to US have come down by 24%. Foreign exchange.
Right, so I understand what you're saying about trade and investment relations. My only point is whether this is an incentive or a long-term objective big enough for the issues on the LSE to be resolved quickly.
You see, the problem is, ma'am, there are some things which cannot be compromised. So the Chinese have to go back to where they were 3 years back. They were before the Galwan clashes where they have to go back. These Dipsang and Demchuk have to be de-escalated. The things have to be back to normal. Then the business and all the other ties can continue. But as long as you have a hostile position at LAC, it cannot be business as usual. And that is what our limited point has been. And that is what we have conveyed to them. It is not that the trade and business takes over the national interest and national pride and the sovereignty of the country. That is for sure. The Chinese wanted ideally that way, but we have made our stand clear time and again. And that is what we have communicated again in these 13, 14, 15 military level talks, and we haven't with Mr. Wengi, when Dr. Jaishankar communicates the same. Mr. Ajit Doval is talking the same thing, and Prime Minister Modi obviously is the leader. He's communicating the same thing to his counterpart. So as no formal meeting happened, so whatever could be conveyed over a handshake, I think that has been conveyed, and it is exactly on the lines what we have taken. There is no change on our foreign policy vis-a-vis any country on that matter.
You have rightly pointed out, and of course there was a clear foreign policy which was continuing from the Indian side. But there is another point which I wanted to highlight is that obviously Defence Minister Rajnath Singh, while addressing to the cabinet and the political leadership of different political parties of India back in September 2020, he said that China claims to have 89,000 square kilometer of Arunachal Pradesh and 38,000 square kilometer of Eastern Ladakh. So problem here is that the claim China is making is related to obviously Arunachal Pradesh entirely, because roughly 84,000 square kilometer is the total square kilometers we're talking about Arunachal Pradesh. But of course they have more 5,000 square kilometers in their mind. They claim that it is of course part of the Tibet, and Tibet is obviously part of China. So here is the problem. They consider that land to be theirs, and it is being claimed by your defense minister. In this situation, of course, do you not think that India is faced with a dilemma where they have to have a stronger case than this while talking to the Chinese? Obviously, if we talk about the border talks, we already had 18 border talks that failed and they were not conclusive. And of course, them talks, they were helpful to maintain the ceasefire, but of course the situation is still as it is.
You see, let me answer that. First of all, China is a country which shares border with around 10 countries but has disputes with 20 countries. And these countries are even where they don't share a border with. So that is beautiful. That is the beauty of China. What do I say? I can claim anything. I can come and say, claim Lahore is mine. I can claim Islamabad is mine. That doesn't change anything. China is free to claim whatever they want, but there's a McMahon line, there's a LAC that is in place. You can claim anything. They are claiming islands of Japan. They can even claim tomorrow something in Mexico. They're free to do that. I mean, China can say, my grandmother came in my dreams and she told me half of Mexico is mine. Well, they can say that. Nobody can stop them from that. Claiming doesn't mean anything. Claiming is if you have our ruled that place, if it was under your thing, and even for that matter, Tibet is an occupation of China. We don't consider Tibet as a part of China. It's an occupation of China, which China has done. Inner Mongolia, Tajikistan, Pamian Valley, they've been all occupied by China in due course of time. China to itna sa tha na, with time it has swallowed to this big size. So that is why they're very sensitive about this one China theory. The moment you start talking anything about one China theory, China starts getting rattled. They are literally shaking. And, vis-a-vis their hegemony over Taiwan, we have increased our relations with Taiwan, and we support the freedom of Taiwan. And we say, look, Taiwan has every right to be where it is. I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily under China. Taiwan can decide its future course of action, and we have increased our relations with Taiwan. So we don't interfere in anybody's internal affairs.
Right, but Pisa, what you're saying seems to be something that can also be said about what India is claiming.
You see, ma'am, it's not you can't compare apples with oranges. Round pegs don't fit in square holes. So vis-a-vis China, there are some facts which I have stated. I have tried to put them in perspective. I cannot wake up at China and say, look, this is mine, this is tomorrow mine. And
all right, I understand that. Let me get another perspective in this, and we'll come back to you. And Farooq, I want you to comment on that as well and share what you think, because at the end of the day, again, when we take a look at the kind of conversations that have been had with the top military leadership and have gone nowhere, and then also possibly any sort of such conflict where we have seen both sides stick to their claims or speak about what it is that they want. How is it that there will be an eventual resolution or negotiation if these are the kind of stances that we're hearing, especially also given the fact that we heard from the Chinese side back in July also that they had said that India must meet at least halfway, but it doesn't seem like they're understanding how the negotiation process works.
Right, Sana, thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me first of all say that I had actually promised to myself that I'm going to try to hold my peace whenever there is an Indian guest, I tend to become combative. So I am going to hopefully try to restrain myself as much as I can.
Sure.
But I wanted to actually point out to something that was pointed out by one of the holy grails of international journalism, right? The Economist. I think 2 weeks ago, Economist actually wrote an editorial, not actually editorial, a special segment, right, on India's media and its punditry, that how it has become a machine to offend all the countries, including the countries that it calls its own allies. And somehow India's media doesn't realize that it keeps on harming the national interest of the country by being extremely combative. So I will submit that in all scenarios, especially when we are talking about China and India, and that is a good start, perhaps one could do without, all this aggressive kind of banter. But regardless, I wanted to actually point out, Ambassador Saab earlier said that, international, politics and regional politics are important, right? And that is very true. Let me also point out a third aspect, that is domestic politics. India is in the middle of its election year, and usually things get very, very aggressive, jingoistic in all elections. We have seen it in the US as well. Just to remind you that Bob Woodward's book that he co-authored with Costa, and the book is called Peril. It actually documents the final days of Trump's presidency when he was refusing to acknowledge that he has lost. And at that time, General Milley had an interaction with his Chinese counterparts to assuage him, to convince, assure them that there isn't going to be any random attack on the country, right? China is very smart when it comes to these matters. For a country that everybody keeps on, Western media keeps on calling undemocratic, they surely understand democracies very well. And what has happened is that they had to ensure that in these final months of the election year, there isn't any kind of misadventure. So this meeting is most welcome between the two heads, and I hope that it leads somewhere. But my only problem is that with the kind of foot and mouth disease that keeps on actually afflicting Indian media and punditry, where everybody has to just keep on proving that they are more jingoistic than others, what you will have is that the collective imagination of the country is so diminished and it is so dumbed down that eventually what happens is that you keep on undermining your own interest. India has committed a cardinal mistake before 2020 of actually projecting itself as a vessel of containment of China, which is not advisable. India's founders, even founders of RSS wouldn't have wanted something of that sort, because they all in the end believe in Hindutva or Indianness, right? And Indianness is not becoming vessel of another country, and that is why Ashley Tellis keeps on reminding Americans, he is an American of Indian origin who actually played a very crucial part in bringing India and America together back in 1990s. He keeps on reminding that you cannot trust on India to become a vehicle of containment of another country. India and China share a long border. It might be contentious, but it is a border. You cannot change your neighbors. And their trade volume has exceeded $135 billion. So with that kind of engagement or interest, why would you want to throw yourself into a fight that is not supposed to be yours? So all this madness about containment and fighting and combativeness, all of this is harming India. And Chinese, allow me, Faisal, I understand that you are eager to ask another question, but I just wanted to complete my thought, finish my thought. And that is that with this kind of situation, I think that India should borrow from China's wisdom. That is that it understands what is going in the other country and how to approach the matter without actually creating more rhetorical red lines for own self.
Exactly. Dr. Jamil, I just wanted to come towards you. Very important question here. Of course, we're talking about 2020 Galwan. That's where it all started. We know that there was a 45-year truce between India and China. It started back in 1975 that no arms would be used against each other. Then suddenly in 2020 we saw that taking place. Do you think that it happening right after India's unilateral steps that it taken in Kashmir? Obviously, I'm talking about related to abrogation of 370 and 35A. Number one, this was the factor, and the second factor is, as Farooq has very smartly highlighted, the fact that of course India portrayed itself that being a billionaire in terms of population, and China being the billionaire in terms of population, they can of course checkmate each other. So here it is, India portrayed itself that it is giant enough to challenge China in South China Sea. This was one of the factor. Obviously we saw in coming days that they became part of Quad. Then Quad slowly and steadily is turning itself, though it calls itself a non-military alliance, but still it keeps on conducting exercises, military exercises, naval exercises. So everything is going with the plan that India has actually portrayed itself into a giant that can challenge the dragon, the Chinese dragon. Can we say that, sir?
I think as an independent analyst, I can only say that India has to evaluate its own interest. And obviously, India, with its allies sitting about 12,000 miles away, and then relying everything on them, putting everything in their in one basket in terms of the conflict we are mentioning about. The regional, the domestic, and as well as the international politics. So from that standpoint, India entering into Quads, it's their right to do that.